Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Yin Khvat. My guest today is Malcolm Davis, a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Malcolm, a warm welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
I understand it's your fifth time in Taiwan. So far, what's been the biggest insight for you?
Look, I think the biggest sense of perception that I'm getting from this visit is the urgency that Taiwan must respond and prepare for the challenge that China presents. We're getting clear indications from China in terms of their military modernization, in terms of the language that is coming from President Xi, of a determination on the part of President Xi to impose unification against the will of the Taiwanese people. And that would probably mean the use of military force. And the concern is that there's not a lot of time to prepare for that contingency. Most of the scenarios that are considered by the national security and strategic policy community are focused very much on the second half of this decade going into the early years of the next decades.
And you met with President Tsai Ing-wen this morning. What did she tell you?
She reinforced this perception that China is determined to impose its will across the straits. And I think that she also reinforced the importance of deterrence. And so that means working with like-minded countries such as the United States, Japan, Australia, and others to collectively work together to make the cost of any use of force by China unacceptable in terms of China's interests. So it's really about focusing on deterrence and deterring that threat. And I think hopefully we can prevent that use of force by China at some point later in this decade.
And I understand that you also had a message for the president.
I wanted to reassure her about Australia's intentions after the visit of Prime Minister Albanese to Beijing, because there's been a lot of concern about whether Australia is shifting focus essentially to align with China or to make concessions to China. And indeed at the conference, every question I got was, is Prime Minister Albanese's visit really about Australia, to borrow a phrase from Game of Thrones, bending the knee to Beijing? And I reassured her that that's not the case. Australia is engaging with China on trade and diplomacy in areas where it's in our mutual interest to do so. But I think this time we recognise that China under Xi Jinping is very much a different sort of state to what it was, say, 10 years ago. We recognise his determination in regards to Taiwan, his willingness to use provocation in the South China Sea. And so we're going in with our eyes open, and that's why you hear Prime Minister Albanese say we engage with China where we can, but we defend our interests where we must, and we don't give in on those interests.
Let's come back to that a little bit later. You mentioned the South China Sea. Let's also talk about the Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr, who is set to visit the US's Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii after attending the APEC summit, which is happening in San Francisco. Let's take a look at what his defense minister said about China and the situation in the South China Sea.
And we repeat, they have neither jurisdiction nor authority to conduct any sort of governmental operations within our 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. And no justification they can give will stand the test of credence before our own people, and more importantly, before the whole world.
Malcolm, so how significant, given the recent and the increasing tensions in the South China Sea, how significant is this trip by the Philippine president to the US's Indo-Pacific Command?
Look, it's really significant. The Philippines has essentially done a 180 since President Marcos came to power. Under President Duterte, Duterte was very much determined to align with Beijing. Under President Marcos, he has moved the Philippines back to a more traditional focus on working with the United States, with Japan, and with Australia. And indeed, Australia is boosting its military-to-military relations with the Philippines. We see the Philippines as very much a rising power in terms of strategic importance in the region. And so for President Marcos to visit Indo-PACOM sends a huge signal of cooperation and collective will to stand up to China. Once again, this is all about deterrence. if Beijing, if Xi Jinping can see that in trying to take Taiwan or in trying to impose control of the South China Sea, he faces collective security from a group of states that are powerful, he may back off.
Mm. So what do you think the President and the John Aquilino, what do you think they'll actually be discussing? Will it actually be military strategies and tactics?
I think it'll be about joint patrolling, because what you've seen in recent weeks is Chinese Coast Guard vessels aggressively acting against Filipino vessels, including ramming them, and trying to interfere with the Philippines' ability to support its forces at Second Thomas Shoal. So I think that what you will see is the US and the Philippines having discussions in terms of practical measures that they can take to deter China from doing those sorts of provocative actions. It could also include discussions about developing common capability. If you're looking at how the Philippines are developing their military, they are moving very rapidly to increase their military capability because they sense a threat from China. So I think that it's that common capability development, that common operational activity, bringing the Philippines back into the fold after the Duterte years, that is really important. I think that will be the focus of the discussions between President Marcos and General Aquilino.
Do you think that the US will accompany the Philippines on their resupply runs to the Sierra Madre ship?
Well, let's see about that. I think that that's something that has been discussed. Certainly, joint patrolling between Australia and the Philippines has been discussed, and it's still being considered in Canberra. I think that's probably something that would be seriously looked at, particularly if the Chinese continue to behave aggressively and provocatively in the South China Sea. So it's something that probably is on the agenda, but not immediately at the top of the agenda. It's probably more down the track a bit.
In a now infamous Foreign Affairs article written by US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, he claimed that the administration's disciplined approach to the Middle East would free up resources for other global priorities and reduce the risk of new Middle Eastern conflicts. Now, this was written before the Hamas attack on Israel. So what does it mean strategically for the US to have its attention diverted to the Middle East?
Well, this was a very interesting theme that came out of the Taipei Security Dialogue. The linkage between what's going on, for example, in Ukraine and now the Middle East, the coordination between Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang, and the role of groups like Hezbollah and Hamas in trying to distract and divert US attention away from the Indo-Pacific region and other areas.
Malcolm, you said coordination.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, basically the potential concern that you are having key figures in Hamas, Hezbollah, in Iran, going up to Moscow for meetings with key government officials. We don't know what goes on at those meetings, obviously, but the concern must be that they're not talking about, the price of vegetables. They're talking about, how to coordinate activities to distract and divert and ultimately wear down US and allied resolve. If you look at what's happening in Ukraine, for example, there's concern that with the Ukrainian counteroffensive having stalled, Western support for Ukraine may begin to break. And at the same time, Western ability to manufacture military capabilities to support Ukraine and now Israel is starting to really stress the US and its allies out in terms of their ability to sustain military support. It's in China's interests to see the US drawn into a military conflict in the Middle East. It's in China's interest to see the US and its allies draw down their munitions and their weapons stockpiles and their capabilities, because then the US is less able to respond to contingencies in the Indo-Pacific region, such as Taiwan or the South China Sea.
So are you saying that there was coordination on the part of China as well?
Well, I think it's uncertain on that regard, but certainly China benefits from the notion that somehow we've got Ukraine, we've got the Middle East, you've got the key leaderships of what's known as this axis of resistance meeting in Moscow, providing military capabilities to each other. it does look an awful lot like some sort of coordination that's going on there.
And more broadly, what do you think are the reputational implications of the Middle East conflict for the United States in, say, the Asian region?
Hamas on October the 7th attacking Israel, we failed to see it happen. We failed to deter it. So it does suggest that there's been a significant failure of intelligence on the part of the US and its Western allies there. What we cannot afford is to have a third failure in regards to Taiwan or the South China Sea, potentially against the Philippines. So I think that there will be an awful lot of soul searching and internal reflection within the US intelligence community, within NATO's intelligence circles about how to respond to these challenges as they come. Because I do think that you are seeing a process of coordination and deliberate planning on the part of this axis of resistance, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Hamas, Hezbollah, against Western democracies. And Taiwan is a logical next target. So I think that we really do need to get our act together in that regard.
Malcolm, so do you agree with some analysts who say that China is deliberately testing the US?
I certainly think they're watching. They're watching US responses. They're watching US resolve, particularly in relation to Ukraine, but also in the Middle East. And they're using that to calibrate their timetable and their planning for actions in areas such as the South China Sea and against Taiwan. And certainly what the US cannot afford to do at this point is start moving forces from the Indo-Pac region into the Middle East or Europe. They have to maintain that strong presence, and if anything, beef up that presence to send the message to Beijing that really, we are here, we're not going anywhere, and don't try anything.
You say that they are watching this and receiving information about the US's response to the Middle East. So what kind of information do you think the CCP, the leaders, are actually getting?
They'll be focusing very much, firstly, at the political level. What is the political debate occurring in Washington, D.C. about the determination of the US to stay engaged globally? And obviously, all of this is occurring against a context of the potential return of President Trump in 2024 and the uncertainty that that brings. But that political debate that's occurring in Washington, D.C. Is then leading to decisions about funding for Ukraine. We've seen that in the US Congress, so the Chinese will be watching that. If there's a sense by the Chinese that the US is losing resolve in Ukraine or is unwilling to respond decisively against threats from Iran and Hezbollah in the Middle East, then that would encourage them and embolden them to actually move more aggressively against Taiwan or in the South China Sea. So I think it's really vital that the US sends strong signals of deterrence and resolve.
So do you think it's more the political signalling that they're watching as opposed to, for example, the Shandong aircraft carrier sailed through the Taiwan Strait, north through the Taiwan Strait, along the median line? There's also, of course, been the Chinese jet that flew within 10 feet of a US bomber. Do you think that they are pushing the envelope in more coercive behaviour?
Yes, they are. I mean, all of those incidents that you're talking about are signals being sent by Beijing to try and get us to back down. The Shandong deployment, I think, sends a very clear signal of Chinese determination to use maritime power and naval power to oppose the US, but also to envelop and encircle Taiwan. And the Chinese are practicing, they're gaining experience in terms of how they would use naval forces, particularly carrier-based air power, in any scenario regarding Taiwan, such as a blockade or an invasion. And I think that when you see these dangerous maneuvers being carried out by Chinese fighter pilots in the South China Sea, once again, that's very much a signal being sent by Beijing. These are not happening because you've got fighter pilots in those cockpits that basically think, let's have a go. They would be told, challenge this aircraft or challenge this helicopter that's flying over the South China Sea. There was a Canadian helicopter that was threatened. So
you think it's coming directly from Xi Jinping?
I can't imagine, given the nature of China's command and control system and the way they think about strategic culture and the way they think about command in war, I can't imagine Chinese fighter pilots being given free rein to do what they like. They would be given very specific signals in terms of how the Chinese Communist Party wants them to behave over the South China Sea, with specific regard to specific targets.
China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, new foreign minister, has criticised what they call camp or bloc confrontation without naming any countries. Let's take a look at what he said. He said historical maritime disputes should be resolved through friendly consultation between direct parties, and maritime camp confrontations and zero-sum games should be resisted. Now, he also said that crisis communication should be improved. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's useful to think about what the former Defence Minister, General Lee, said recently in the Shangri-La Dialogue, where he said, look, if you want peace in the South China Sea, leave it to us. Don't send your forces into the South China Sea. So basically he's saying, we want you to abandon the South China Sea, which are international waters in international airspace, to control of China. And when China talks about blocks and camps, what they're doing is they're attacking Western alliances. They're saying, we want the Western alliance gone from East Asia and the Western Pacific. We want this to be our zone of control. So it just doesn't have any credibility in the eyes of Washington, D.C. or Canberra or Tokyo or Seoul, because we all understand what the Chinese really want, which is control. They want to impose their own sphere of influence across the Indo-Pacific region, and particularly in the within what's known as the first and second island chains.
Malcolm, an Australian think tank, China Matters, has released a report in which it says that the mainstream Chinese opinion is that Australia has fallen firmly into the orbit of the United States and has become, in effect, a vassal state. What do you make of the views of China, Chinese views, in the report?
Look, I think that the notion that somehow we're a vassal of the United States is complete nonsense. If we were a vassal of the United States, I don't think Prime Minister Albanese would have visited Beijing. He would not have gone to Beijing on the 50th anniversary of Prime Minister Gough Whitlam's visit to sign trade deals, to stabilise the relationship, to open up diplomatic engagement. It's a common attack on US-Australian defence and security relations by saying we're a vassal. And they've been the group that are pushing this, China Matters, and other groups in Australia have been saying, oh, well, AUKUS ties us into a US war against China over Taiwan, which is nonsense because Australia is a sovereign country. We make our own decisions. It is our choice to decide whether we choose to join that war or we choose not to join that war. And we'll make that choice based on our own strategic interests at the time, not based on essentially some pressure from groups inside Australia that I think pretty much are seeking to bring Australia closer to China at the expense of the US-Australia defence relationship. So I don't hold China Matters in high regard.
Okay, and it's interesting the timing of the release, just as Anthony Albanese visited China, just as it seems that we're getting to a thaw in the relationship. Beijing is already relaxed the tariffs on certain goods, lobsters, and it looks like it will do with wine imports from Australia as well. Would you say that Australia or China has the upper hand in the relationship?
China's wolf warrior tactics that are practiced between 2015 and essentially 2021, 2022, I think failed miserably and basically created more harm than good. I think the Chinese have realised that wolf warrior pressure is not working. So they're at the tactical level in terms of diplomatic engagement, they've switched tactics to a more softer engagement process, but they haven't changed their strategic ambitions or goals. And this is why when Prime Minister Albanese, I think having gone to Beijing now, and I think having had discussions with Xi Jinping, he'll be held to high standards in terms of avoiding making concessions in the future, because the last thing we want to see is a perception that the Australian government is making concessions to China. Now, I'm certain that Beijing will try to get us to make further concessions. They'll say, look, we've met you halfway, we've released some bans on trade and so forth, but you need to make further concessions if you want to see, for example, Australian citizens in jail released, or if you want to see further progress. We shouldn't accept that. Because it was China that created this crisis in the first place. So I do think that the trip by Albanese to Beijing can be seen in pretty much a positive light, because we've done so in a responsible way, not in a way that essentially sees us viewing China through rose-coloured glasses, that somehow this is a reset back to 2012. It's not.
But you expect there would be more concessions demanded by China. Let's talk about the comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is a trade bloc that China wants entry into, so does Taiwan. Now, Australia has said that it will not block China's path, and it will also not support Taiwan. Do you think China has won then in this regard?
No, because I think that Australia has said to China, look, we expect you to continue to change your trade practices to achieve a higher standard before you go into CPTPP, which is what we're talking about. I think in terms of Taiwan, my understanding is that they have not said to Taiwan that they don't support Taiwan membership. They've left it open. So I think that is sensible diplomacy, because they know that if China continues to undertake provocations in the South China Sea or against Taiwan, to suggest that somehow a liberal democracy like Taiwan of 24 million people with a rapidly growing, strong, prosperous economy is not suitable for membership in CPTPP is nonsense. And I don't think we're going to essentially accept Chinese pressure. I'm sure that Beijing will try and pressure us to do that. But I don't see Albanese essentially saying to Taiwan, no, you are not suitable for membership.
Following Albanese's trip to China, he also visited the Cook Islands for the Pacific Islands Forum. Now, Papua New Guinea's Minister of State, Justin Kachenko, said, when Australia is working closely with China, it helps us and makes it easier for the Pacific. What did he mean?
I think that when you look at Pacific Island states and their security concerns, they're not so focused on major power competition between China and the US. They don't see that as so much as important as climate change. And to a certain degree, that's understandable, because some of these small Pacific Island states are very low-lying. And as climate change intensifies and accelerates, global warming is going to drive up sea levels. I think what they're implying with that statement is we need to work with China on climate change issues and these sorts of issues, rather than getting sidetracked into major power competition. The problem is that whilst that makes eminent sense, we can't ignore China's growing presence and influence in the Indo-Pacific region, and we focus on the Southwest Pacific. In 2022, China signed a security agreement with Solomon Islands, and if you look at the text in that agreement, it gives them the potential to create a military base there in the Solomon Islands. If they do that, then you have the potential for Chinese military forces to operate a mere 2,000 kilometres off our eastern seaboard. And we haven't been threatened in that way since 1942 with the Japanese. So that would fundamentally change our strategic outlook for the worse. And so we're very concerned about growing Chinese presence in the Indo-Pacific region and in the Southwest Pacific, and in particular places like Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste. These locations, if China gains a presence, effectively allows China to encircle Australia and cut off our access to sea lanes communication between Australia and the United States and Australia and Asia, potentially interfering in submarine cables that carry the internet. So we do have legitimate concerns about China in the Southwest Pacific.
Okay, very finally, you talked about possible encirclement by China. How does that affect Australia's role in any Taiwan contingency?
If we have a situation at some point in the future where China has forward bases in the Southwest Pacific, they could then threaten to launch attacks against our eastern military bases, our eastern urban areas, ports, airports, air bases.
There's a lot of joint US military.
Exactly. ASEAN dialogue has resulted in increasing US access to Australian facilities, and from a purely military operational perspective, it would make eminent tactical sense for the Chinese to attack those bases, to deny them to the US. So I think that we would be very concerned about a Chinese military presence in the Southwest Pacific, because it would potentially interfere with our ability to support the US in a Taiwan contingency. But there's also the scenario of what happens after Taiwan if the Chinese are successful and they control this island. If they have military bases in the Southwest Pacific, they can then cut off the sea lands communication to Japan. They already control Taiwan, so they basically close down the northern end of the South China Sea. With those bases in the Southwest Pacific, they cut off the sea lanes communication to Japan, so then they can coerce Tokyo to accepting their domination. And I think if you wanted to look at a long-term strategy for Beijing in terms of their thinking on a community of common destiny, a Chinese sphere of influence, that would be in their thinking too.
Malcolm Davis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
If you liked our show, please give us a thumbs up, hit subscribe, and see you next time.